Good afternoon. Thank you for joining our program on education policy and governance. I am Paul Peterson, and I am the director of the program here at Harvard University. We have an online audience, so that's why we try to begin promptly at 1:15. We are very fortunate today to have Robin Lake, who's the director of the Center on Reinventing Public Education, to talk with us about the most important issue facing our educational system at the current time, the learning loss that has occurred as a result of the closure of schools in response to the COVID pandemic. And it's great to have Robin Lake with us because she has tracked what schools were doing over this period of time. She's long been interested in how schools can be more imaginative in the way in which they design their programs. And she has proven to be so influential as people think about new directions in our educational system. So, Robin, thank you very much for joining us today. Here at Harvard University.
My pleasure. Thank you all for taking a little bit of time. Hello to everybody online. Well, yeah, it's a really interesting time to take stock. Since the beginning of the pandemic, as Paul said, my organization has really tried to be a sense maker and to track knowledge where we could find it. As you can imagine, we had to get pretty creative in how we could collect data. In particular, we wanted to know how are school systems and states responding to the needs as they were emerging from I'm in Seattle, so I saw things unfolding very quickly and we just jumped in. And then the other thing that we've tried to do is organize the research community and organize knowledge so that we could make sense of it all very quickly and get it out to the field. And Marty West was kind enough to participate in some things that we call consensus panels, where we bring together experts and review the research as it's coming in and putting out papers. So I'm not going to go through all of the vast stuff that we've got. Go to our website or crpe.org and the Evidence Project. There's a ton of information there. What I want to do today is talk about a report that we put out just about a month ago called The State of the American Student. And that report was meant to make sense at the end of whatever period we're in of the pandemic, of where kids are, so that we can take an annual look at this for the next 5 years or so and maybe bang a drumbeat of attention on where kids are, how systems are responding, and for me, most importantly, where do we go from here? You know, after spending 30 years or so in this business, it feels like a moment that we need to capture. So I am going to start with the very basics. Now, if any of you have been tracking the newspapers, you saw that the NAEP results come out. It's big news, and we can discuss that. We have great experts here to help kind of unpack those numbers. But what I will say is I was not surprised by the results. They were the latest, but just a month ago, we had an earlier release of NAEP results looking at the long-term trends. We saw a sharp decline in ACT scores. Looking at state exams, the results have been consistent that, yes, kids are not all right. They suffered academically for sure. The declines are bigger in math and they're serious. I'll just put, it's easy to look at these test score results and think, other numbers, they're bad, but just to put it in really sharp relief, we're seeing numbers coming out of places like LA Unified that are showing that 11th graders' proficiency in math scores are just incredibly alarming. Only 81% or 82% of LA 11th graders met proficiency in math in the last year, according to the LA Times. And I mean, that's big, right? And that's very urgent. Those kids only have months left in the system to be able to meet their needs. And then we have the emotional needs, which are huge as well. I'll show you a little bit of numbers there, but any parent knows that their kids suffered for isolation, developmental issues, kids with disabilities who lost access to therapies, all of that. It's real, it's big, it's not going away anytime soon. And we know for sure that students on the margins suffered more. The gaps are growing between low performers and high performers, and those tend to be students of colors, lower income kids, students with disabilities, and English learners and such, right? The other thing that I want to just make a point on is when we see these averages, I think they mask a huge important reality, which is incredible variation, incredible. So we're seeing that the variation across, certainly, ages and grade levels, subject areas, all of that. It's a very complex picture. We're seeing interesting stuff in the NAEP findings, interesting stuff in states that we're trying to unpack. But we also know that some students thrived during the pandemic. We're trying to make sense of that. What does that mean for going forward more effectively? And we also know that that any individual kid is a really complex reality right now. Todd Rose would say a jagged profile. And so that's a really hard thing for schools to address. They are not historically good at addressing all of that complexity and being able to, kind of hone their instructional approaches to meet that complexity. So we have serious work ahead. Yeah, I promise not to show a lot of test score results, but this one from the last NAEP release for 9-year-olds and the long-term trends, I thought really made the point visually that the gaps between the high performers and the low performers are really growing. You can see that especially in math, but in reading as well. I do think it's important to just pause on this this question of emotional and developmental challenges. We saw a number of facts that gave us serious pause. Attempts among girls 12 to 17, suicide attempts up 50% in the course of 1 year. I believe that was year before last. The fact that so many kids have lost a parent or a caregiver, students with disabilities who reported that their kids' right to an equitable education was not addressed when they moved to remote learning. These are really issues that are going to stick with the kids for a long time. When we've convened some consensus panels around social emotional learning and mental health, all the experts are saying it's not going away anytime soon. And our system was broken well before the pandemic and is not equipped to address these needs effectively. So this is like, this is a little bit of a sad talk. We'll get to some good stuff at the end. The other sad news, I think, is, at least from my perspective, this was entirely predictable on a couple of fronts. That, if you looked at the rollout in the spring 2020, in fall 2020, when schools were struggling to figure out if they would open, reopen, hybrid, not, masks, all that chaos. Fall 2021, when they were hit again with Delta and Omicron, what I've seen is a cycle of denial and sort of a continuous belief that it's all going to be okay. We're just going to chug along and do what we've always done, or attend to the crises right in front of us. And we just weren't prepared. We were on the back of our heels. Politics drove too much decision making, and it was a mess. It was really a mess, and it hit. Show you some numbers. It hit our most vulnerable populations hard, as one might expect. And the second point I just want to make here is this was really failure by design in my view. We saw a system unroll before us that is hardwired for inequality, and that is why it hit the most vulnerable students the hardest. Let me give you just a little bit of data on those points. So this is spring 2020. We were collecting data on school district responses, and we were alarmed to see, toward the end of the school year, that there was really still very little instruction actually happening. A full 2/3 of the districts that we sampled, representative, were offering things like packets to kids and really putting most of the instructional responsibility on parents. And so, we were concerned. Things, of course, got better than that, but better often entailed when kids went back to school, it was Zoom in a room, in that there were teachers outside the building or in a different room in the building who were doing Zoom with the kids. Kids were in school, but they still weren't getting actual instruction. And this, didn't play out equally across the country. And so when we broke those numbers down by free and reduced lunch, we saw a real differentiation, twice as likely that affluent districts were requiring live instruction. And here, I'll just take you to the NAEP survey results that were just released. I don't think that people have been paying much attention to the survey results. I think they're super, super interesting. And this one in particular caught my eye because it reflected what we were seeing in our data. So you're seeing here the proportion of lower performing students that have had access to things like computers, internet, supplies available, quiet place to work during remote learning. And then toward the end there, a teacher that was available to help them, real-time video lessons. And wow, why are we surprised that our gaps are widening here? And this is something that, these inequalities existed pre-pandemic. We should be outraged by them. We also should be outraged that lower income students often don't get access to high quality teachers at the same rate. And then, I guess my final reflection on this sort of looking backward is that states were checked out. We really asked districts to take all of this on themselves. And so what you're seeing here is the number of states that were requiring, in the dark blue, recommending or just had nothing to say about things like strategies for accelerating learning, access, assessing student learning needs, guidance for teachers on practices to support, all of the stuff that we knew needed to be in place to support remote learning. States were just not weighing in. And so local politics took over. There have been a number of analyses on how local politics played out in school opening and closing decisions. So I'm just showing you ours right now, but I can point you to a number of these. So what you're seeing here is we took a look at the districts that we were tracking, and we wanted to know, were there reopening or closing decisions based on an empirical framework of some kind? So we took one, Johns Hopkins, guidance for reopening decisions given the local health conditions, and we assessed which districts were actually opening despite the fact that their local conditions said, according to Johns Hopkins, it's really not safe to open. I want to acknowledge the science was evolving really quickly, and in hindsight, maybe we would have thought about it differently, but you can see that, there's a cluster here that's mostly in the South. These are mostly Republican states where, they were listening to President Trump at the time, and they were saying, we're going for it. And then here we have a totally different picture. These are districts that are, will appear to be overly cautious. Health conditions said, yeah, go ahead and open. And they were, oftentimes listening to their teachers' unions and saying, no, we're gonna stay closed. And you can see these tend to be heavily union influenced states here. I mean, this is just one snapshot, right? We saw the local politics play out in masking discussions, more recently in critical race theory discussions, now around things like social emotional learning. I think the bottom line for me is we did not protect our schools from the politics of all this other stuff that was happening. In fact, we weaponized our schools, unlike many other countries. All right. So, where do we go from here, given what we've got in front of us? I not feeling particularly optimistic right now because when we look at the district response, the opportunity they have in front of them with federal funding, things are not looking great. When you look at how they're spending their money compared to what we know works for catching kids up. Tom Kane and Dan Goldhaber have done some just tremendous work in this area, looking at kind of known interventions and what it's going to take in spending. And, their prognosis was sort of, the districts need to be spending basically all of their federal funds on things like tutoring and high quality curriculum right now. And that's not the case. So we do a national study with RAND called the American School District Panel. We look at districts on a regular basis and survey them on a number of things. Only 1 in 5 in a recent survey said that they had added a new tutoring program. Now, many of them had already had tutoring programs, but are they adding them? Are they targeting them to the kids most in need? Are they offering them to all kids? It's not looking great. And when we look at the federal funding, Edunomics Lab has been really wringing their hands around. All this money has gone to districts, but they're not spending adequately. The bottom line there is that districts are having trouble. They'd like to open tutoring programs and things, but they can't find the staff to come through their normal channels. And so they're sort of at a standstill, not knowing what to do next. And then we and Future Ed have looked at the spending plans that districts have in place, how they say they want to spend their federal funds. And they're all over the place. They're trying to, I think districts are doing their best to accommodate a lot of various interests. And they're doing things like building football fields, things like that. Now, a lot of the money is intended to be for mental health services and academic interventions, but it's just spread all over the place. And then they have these staffing problems. They can't hire people, and it's not looking great, guys. I wanted to mention another study that we're doing a deep dive also with RAND into implementation that districts are doing around learning loss. And we see these struggles playing out in real time with them. So they had really ambitious plans for accelerating learning, really wanted to go deep and make lasting change in the way that they identify learning gaps and address them for kids, but they're being undermined constantly by staffing challenges, sometimes staffing resistance, fires that they have to put out, political fights they have to attend to, and they are worried themselves about being able to implement the things that they want to be able to implement. And I'll just say too that I think this last point, that parents don't think there's a problem, for me is one of the most jarring and worrisome points. That a couple of surveys have been done where parents say, no, I think my kid's okay, doesn't need tutoring services. And so the demand's not really there, the capacity is not really there from districts. And here's just another, a little bit from the new NAEP results on the surveys. This is an interesting one. I had to dig deep to find it, but I found it last night and I wanted to pop it in here because this one is asking teachers about their confidence in being able to just teach in general. But then this last line here is their confidence in addressing knowledge and skill gaps. And you can see, that there is a lot of variation among our teachers nationally. But the confidence level drops significantly when they're moving from just, I know how to teach a class to I know how to address these skill gaps that are in front of us. So I'll just sum up for you. This is where I sit, how I see the situation in front of us. We've got a problem. We've got a problem on multiple fronts. It's a very complex set of problems, and we have all these jagged profiles to attend to. Meanwhile, our K-12 systems are not at their best. They are folks are exhausted. They've been working so incredibly hard, and and killing themselves really to attend to everything that's going on. We have these continual political divisions, or lack of trust in government. And we have a situation that is in front of us, which is when federal funds run out, school districts are going to face these enrollment declines and fiscal cliffs that are going to be very, very difficult for them to attend to. So I should say, they're already seeing enrollment declines, but when that's combined with the federal money running out, they're going to be in a world of hurt in terms of having to close schools and things. And so, for me, it just means we got to innovate. We got to think about this differently and very creatively attend to these pre-existing rigidities and structural inequalities in our system and attack what one superintendent described as our addiction to the status quo. I'm really seeing that right now. This return, this kind of grasping toward normalcy, holding tight to the steering wheel. This is what I was taught in ed school. This is what I'm going to keep doing, and not looking at how do we play with the margins and do things differently. Okay, I promise to end on something a little more upbeat. There's a lot of great stuff going on, and I pulled some examples from an effort that we've got going called the Edu Recovery Hub, to take plans that districts have put forward in their ESSER money, and just pull out some of the things that are really interesting. I'll tell you about a few of them that I really love. The Oakland Reach is a parent advocacy organization in California. They said, okay, district, if you can't hire the tutors, we will provide you the tutors. We will train up our parents in Oakland to go into Oakland Public Schools. Oakland will pay them, and they will become better advocates for their kids, and they will help some kids right now. That's great. Some states like Tennessee have really stepped up and said, we're going to do a statewide tutoring program so that districts don't have to worry about it. And they're deploying parents and volunteers, community members to step in and help. They're working with Zern, the online math provider, in a really creative approach to provide the curriculums and all. And then we're seeing through the National Summer School Institute, places like Mesa, Arizona, that folks are saying, hey, let's play with this idea about one teacher and 30 kids. Maybe that's not the best way to structure things. And maybe if we played with organizing teachers differently in teams and specializations, using community educators, we could really lift off this problem and do things differently. And a number of states are just freeing up funds right now to get to families to solve problems that districts aren't able to do that, whether it's through a tutoring fund or an educational savings account, providing more choice within districts or in the charter space or whatever. There's movement out there and it's promising, but I think this is, if I had to say, like a small number of things that we should focus on right now, I would say, proven interventions, more of that. We got to set ambitious goals for recovery, be clear about them, and track progress toward them. We're seeing states sort of, pulling the shades over the numbers, and we got to open up the shades and talk about them, convene people, and say what we're going to do about them. We need to have a research and development strategy about some of these emerging strategies that could take the pressure off of educators and make things more doable for them. And I think we need to get to a solution around individualized learning plans and pathways for all students. I was really excited to see this. We have a final thing, and love to hear what you all think. But I was excited to see that Virginia has just put out a learning recovery plan that will provide a data snapshot for every child in the state. And then an individualized learning plan will be required for every child. And at the same time, they're lifting up state standards to set more ambitious goals, even though they know it will make them look worse in the short term. So.
Well, thank you, Robin, for that excellent analysis of where we are and useful suggestions as to where we might go. So there's a lot of questions that come to mind as you lay out these facts but let me open it up. Does anybody? Yes.
I had a question about the survey results saying that parents don't think that their students are behind.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether there's any insights into they're comparing and thinking that, everyone lost this time in school. And so my student is probably comparable to everyone else versus like where they would have been expected to be without.
Yes, that's a really great hypothesis. And I think we don't know, and it's a great opportunity for research, to get underneath that. That's a really strong possibility. Another possibility is grading standards. We know were loosened up during the pandemic and we think are still looser than they were before. And so, if a parent is getting a report card home from school that's all A's, they're feeling pretty good. They're feeling like, yeah, my kid's doing well. Somebody else's kid. And I think another dynamic that may be at play is parents are famous for loving their school, even though they think other schools are not doing. Public education is not doing so well, but my school's great. It's sort of I think, I'm making the right decision for my child. Make yourself feel okay about the decision, where your child is and what's going on. So, there maybe other dynamics at play, but I think we have to get under that. We have to understand what's going on so that we can help inform them about what's happening in creative ways.
Yes.
I have two questions. One was when you showed the map of like different schools opening and not opening, are there studies that show like how their level of test scores have differed, ones that have stayed put, they open? And then my second question is like personally, I have like relatives with children in school, and previously, like for example, one of my cousins was like has bliss, and so he's like bullied in school, and so he actually did a lot better. So his kids did a lot better virtually online. So like, do you have you seen any like hybrid type models working now? That kind of over, like what do you see that in the future?
Yeah. Well, on your first point, the longer that kids were in remote instruction seemed, through a variety of studies that our consensus panel looked at, seemed to be a strong predictor of how they did academically. And and I think, Marty, is it right that actually trumped some of the other demographic characteristics of kids?
Yeah, I would say that that's the case. I think the puzzling thing in the past week has been that at the state level, the amount of ground that students lost on average doesn't seem to be powerfully driven by like state level policy around remote instruction. I think that's because there was actually much more, we tend to think of all the red states opening up their schools immediately and all the blue states staying closed for 2 years. But actually there was a lot of variation within states and what students were actually experiencing. And so I think the studies that have been able to more directly compare students in the same state exposed to remote and in-person instruction, it's clear that in-person instruction was more effective for the vast majority of students. But then there are some students who, because of bullying issues, because of just their own learning needs, who did thrive in hybrid or online modes. But I think my takeaway from this, from all the latest sets of results, is that the number of those students for whom that was a positive change is really quite small, because otherwise they would be showing up in the data more systematically. And really just the losses are so pervasive across geographies, across demographic groups. So it without denying that reality at all, and the fact that there's probably things to learn from that reality, I think it was a relatively small phenomenon.
Yeah, I am curious, as we're able to get more sophisticated in analyzing the data, how much access to live instruction mattered during remote. I think that'll be important for us to understand. For kids who want to continue virtual for whatever reason, and God forbid if we have another, thing where we have to go online. I will say too that, we looked at pandemic learning pods over the course of the pandemic. We wanted to know, when families go offline and just construct education for their students, what do they do with that opportunity? And many of those kids were doing virtual instruction, but they were also, going out and exploring and just having a great time. And we found that parents said they loved the joyful nature of that. They loved being able to be more in control of their kids' schedule, or for the kid to be more in control and have more agency over their learning. And teachers really, really loved the pods. And they said, just the ability to have stronger relationships with students was a huge factor, such a huge factor for them, that many decided not to go back to traditional public education after they taught in a pod. So I think to your last question about, innovative models that are popping up, there's somebody in Boston, actually, I think, who's supporting a national infrastructure to support pods at scale. Kai pods is what they're called. And I think that's really interesting, because he's bringing a whole system to supporting small learning communities and trying to make it possible for more people to do that. And then there are charter schools that are now opening up what they call micro schools, and they're essentially in-person spaces where kids come and do virtual learning. They might come just 2 or 3 days a week, and they get hands-on support and catch up and whatever they need, play with friends, but they can do virtual learning when they want to. So I think all of that is starting to arise. It's real, it's really emergent out there, but it's constrained by a family's ability to pay for those services. So I think freeing up some more funds to make that possible is essential.
So do you see that as the wave of the future, that we will be moving away from the brick and mortar school as we've known it, or is this going to be just on the edges of the system?
And do we know whether anyone's learning things that are aligned to the gaps that you motivated, in those pods?
We do not. That is a black hole of knowledge. We do not, and we've seen that. We looked at a couple of pods that were spending much less time on instruction than kids would normally have. And, the researchers all said, oh my gosh, maybe this is a big problem. Maybe they're not actually teaching anything. And that was my first instinct as well. But then I've talked to some homeschool families who say, we can do the same learning that the public school does, and we can do it in 3 hours. We don't need more than 3 hours actually to get all that learning done. And then we have time, if we do it really efficiently and in small group settings. So, it's an open question still. I bet it's like, for me, it's the early days of the charter school space where there's just, it's everything. And I think some of it will be high quality, some of it won't. I keep thinking about, well, I told you about this yesterday, Paul, the day before, that some kind of a statewide infrastructure to support innovative models like pods and micro schools to oversee quality and to provide support to teachers who might not, have all the professional development supports they'd normally get in a school district. That could be a really interesting model for states to play with. And I don't know where it's going to go. I mean, I think that there is certainly demand for it. There's unmet demand, especially among families of color and lower income families, I think. But people are really drawn to what they're familiar with too. So, I'm of the view we should just let people decide, say what they want, decide what they want, keep building evidence and new possibilities for them.
All right, somebody had their hand up. Yes.
Thank you for the talk. It's really interesting. I was wondering if you could speak more on this kind of decline in enrollments and the sort of impending fiscal cliff. It strikes me that COVID's, as awful and terrible as it was, it's such a great example of the benefits of education quantified for the first time in a very real way.
Yes. Schools matter, it turns
yeah.
out.
which is fantastic to have that evidence despite the difficulty. But I wondered if those enrollment trends were longer term and how much COVID affected them. I know it might be too early to tell.
Yeah, I'm so hungry for actual national data on this. And so if people are aware of data sources, I'm really curious to see any projections that folks are developing based on surveys of national mobility of parents right now, because we know parents, during the pandemic picked up and moved to areas because they could, it was easier for them to work remotely, and that exacerbated some of the enrollment shifts, but they were already at play. And we've studied enrollment growth and decline over the past decades a lot, especially in urban areas. And we've seen urban areas shrink dramatically and then start climbing dramatically and struggling with all of it. They are not really built for change. And politically, this was a real problem for the charter school movement, because charter schools were often targeting urban areas because that's where the need was. And places like Oakland, California, who had already been losing enrollment to just demographic shifts, we're losing even more enrollment to charter schools. But all of that came to fall on the charters, and it became this political nightmare because you can only lose enrollment for so long before you have to close schools. And oftentimes you're closing schools in the lower income areas because growth is happening in gentrifying cities in the higher income areas. It's a mess. It's a big, big mess politically. Federal funding came in during the pandemic, and many urban school districts have used that to plug those holes that pre-existed. And so that's why I'm so concerned about that federal money going away, because I think we're about to see school closures come up real hard. But then, we also have these mobility shifts. And so I think there will be rural districts, some like edge suburban areas that are growing in ways that they didn't expect very quickly. And will they just keep building the same types of schools for those folks, or will they try to innovate? Probably just build what they knew.
So we have at Education Next, the journal that Marty edits, we have a survey that we do every so often. And during the pandemic, on 3 occasions, we asked parents what school their child attended. And we detected 6% of the students attending homeschooling or reporting homeschooling, which was quite a bit more than the 3% that the U.S. Department of Education had been reporting prior, and then what we had found several years earlier. So that looked like it was a pretty big shift. The question was whether or not that would persist, because that showed up right away. But in our 3rd round, which was at the end of this past school year, that 6% was still there. So that suggests there was some significant changes there. The percentage of students attending traditional public schools declined by 4 percentage points. So that's 2 million students. So that's a lot. And that's not just shifting from big city school systems to suburban or rural school systems. That's shifting out of the traditional public school. And the private school enrollments were up and the charter school enrollments were up. So there was some of that kind of migration. I think there's also just students in high school are leaving school, and job opportunities are much improved for high school students because of the shortage of labor. And so, not going to school can be maybe sound pretty good to those who can get a job, even though it's entry-level job, it's still real money. And some people may see that as desirable. And also parents are holding back very young children. I think during the pandemic, why should we send our child to kindergarten if they're going to be taught kindergarten online? I just think we'll keep them at home for another year. So I think it's a very big, complicated story that all of which could show up in enrollment declines. So in coming, how this is going to play out in 3-4 more years, we don't know for sure. But I think it's
20,000 kids missing in LA. They just don't know where they went. I mean, this is a problem with our data systems too. We don't, track within states student to student student movement across districts or outside the state, or, it's just very hard to see where kids have gone or if they're off the rolls entirely.
Yeah, a school system classifies a student as either enrolled or not enrolled. So if they're not enrolled, well, then they don't worry about them after that. And the same is true of, then they worry about them if they're enrolled but they don't show up. So then they're absent. So then absenteeism is going up. And then it's chronic absenteeism. Then you get really worried. And so, and we know that chronic absenteeism predicts departure from the school system. But then once they depart, then they fall off the statistics because, okay, we can't find them. We don't know where they are. And so we'll just not count them. So absolutely, our databases, it's not so easy to fix them though, if you think about it. So if a school system is going to try and attract people after they have left the school system and they're not showing up, where are they? Are they working at the local drugstore, or what are they doing? It's not an easy task.
No, but I think that, I hear a lot of people really worrying about those kids, which they should be, and trying to figure out how to bring them back, as fast as possible. And we want our districts to be competing for students. That's great. They should really respond. But, I think that students who have left the system or have moved to a different school are really sending an important message that we have to pay attention to. They don't want what that place was offering. And so, I think it's really time to just blow up our high school model, I think. It's not working for kids. And so, reimagine it so it's more relevant, so kids know that they are on track to have long-term gains in their life because of their high school experience. And also, some districts have said, okay, if you need to work, we will work around you. If we'll deliver education in the evening for you so that you can go to your job and provide for your family right now. But it's so important that you graduate and that we believe in you, we're going to adapt. I also think that at this point, for this generation of kids, if they drop out of the system, we should find ways to help them on-ramp back on when it makes sense for them. Not necessarily high school, but, have a fund that's available for them for later education so they can retool and get into long-term, high-paying career options.
All well said. Any further comments, reactions?
I'll
Yeah,
say
Brian.
I'm
Yeah.
still stuck because I think it's like the root of the dilemma that we're at right now with the fact that parents don't perceive their child as having a problem.
Yeah.
And I don't know how to change that. Like I've been out banging the drum with NAEP scores, and I've been trying as a state board member to, bring a sense of urgency to the department's work with school districts, but I just don't see any sense of urgency at the local level. And I think that's because parents really just wanted things to go back to normal as quickly as possible. And maybe that what they really care about is how their child's doing relative to the people they come across, and that's what's driving their perceptions. But
Yeah.
so I guess what who and what is going to change that perception?
Well,
It's
I
a
think
tough
Ira has
messaging
an
PR
idea, but my thought just is this comes from a parent perspective. I care about my own kids' scores and I want to see them. And when my son did his ACT practice tests, I found out, oh my God, he had big holes in his math skills that nobody had told me about. He's gone to great schools. Nobody told me. And so it wasn't until I saw those holes that he didn't understand certain concepts. He wasn't mastering certain skills that I went, oh my gosh, we have to do something. And so I think we owe parents honesty about where their kid is in terms that are really meaningful to them. And I don't know exactly, I think that it bears some research to figure out like what would be the thing that would be really meaningful. But I think also it also has to feel like it's really important. Like I knew the ACT scores mattered because that would get him into college or not, and so that, we'll talk about that. We're talking about accountability a little bit. I think, we've said all these standards are really important. They're not. They're actually not all equally important. Which are the really important ones? We have to get real with parents. Well, Ira, would you think of
So I just to add to that conversation, I have a granddaughter who took a test for admission to a program. And when it came back, there was the same thing. There was a section of the math test, which she had never been taught the material. So she didn't do very talented job, but she hadn't studied that. So she couldn't do it. But that's the first time her mother had discovered that this was a missing component. So there must be, if we got two examples, there must be many more out there like that. So that does suggest much more detailed information should be sent back to parents. And I think school systems are systematically uninforming parents. Instead, I think we need to get away from blaming parents and get towards blaming schools for not informing parents, for not letting parents know what the true situation is. And these congratulatory grades or non-grades that are being handed out in these report cards are designed to make parents happy and satisfied and not critical of the school system, and maybe perfectly uninformative, in fact, negatively informative about how well the child is doing. I don't know how you feel about that, Robin. Do you think that schools really want parents not to be informed?
I think their teachers really care about their kids, and they don't want to hurt them, and they think that bad grades hurt them, and so they try to be generous, so like, wow. And they try to look to effort. They think effort should be rewarded, and they see kids working hard, and so there's a certain generosity at play that I think is, a great thing in teachers. They want to help kids, feel good about themselves and move along. Also, especially private schools, they want to keep parents happy, but they're also working on their branding with folks like Harvard. Our A's mean something here at this school, so they have to balance all that. So I think it's complicated, but definitely during the pandemic, there's been a big, loosening up, and we don't want students to pay the price for this chaos. And so we're going to be generous with grades. We're going to be generous with graduation standards. But ultimately, kids are going out, they're landing in colleges unprepared, and they're going out to a career, and they're going to get stuck because they don't have what they need. So it doesn't serve them well ultimately, but that's what we're doing.
All right.
Oh, I just kind of had a comment on what you guys have both said, because I struggle with the whole ACT test score thing, because I generally don't believe that ACTs are taught to students in school in general. You don't learn that type of math or English in public school education. And so I feel like more of the bonus is, again, on the school to kind of reassess their students, maybe with statewide tests, to see how far the learning gap is, and then adapt the curriculum to make up for those gaps instead of having more this. What are your thoughts on that? Do you see that happening?
Yeah, that's the dream. There are efforts. There are a lot of efforts to kind of rethink assessment and accountability systems, especially right now, and implementation rarely, has gotten to the place where schools are really gearing toward that. Instead, folks have been looking at proficiency scores. Statewide exams don't mean so much to them. They're using their own exams that they're doing in their classroom, which may or may not be pegged to anything. And so it's a messy situation now, but this seems like a solvable problem to me, really. We should be able to say, what are the skills and competencies that really matter right now and will matter for the jobs of the future, which is a whole nother thing, but what are they really? And then how do we assess those things, and how do we make sure that holes in in those skills and knowledge are being addressed very quickly.
Yeah, I guess my question is like, what do you think of the barriers to like?
Oh, what are the
getting
barriers?
it? Like,
Oh,
is it just like science so much, or just not funding it?
Well, right now, I mean, to be honest, one of the big barriers is there's been such a backlash against testing that the push is for doing away with testing altogether. That's what we're seeing in a lot of state houses at the federal level. Just a complete, these are not legitimate. Let's do away with them. Let teachers have their own tests. That's not gonna hold long term, but there is a political dynamic now that's very anti-testing and very much about the whole, like assessing the whole child, which potentially takes away from the academic focus and tries to go more toward, social emotional learning and all. And so that becomes just sort of a watering down of expectations and assessments and accountability systems. I mean, there's a lot of money right now. And so, is money a barrier? Not really. I mean, if we wanted to prioritize it, the money's there in my view. There are technical issues, but there are lots of smart people around. What do you think, Marty?
I don't know. I wouldn't understate just the challenges of achieving consensus on exactly what students should know and be able to do,
Yes.
and how that should be organized across grade levels. I mean, states have by and large done that, but I think state standards right now typically don't have the granularity that you would need in order to then provide like very specific feedback on students about what what skills they can do and don't have. Like that's what benchmark assessments are better at doing in discrete areas. So I don't think that state testing systems are not right now able to provide the type of data that would be useful for a more targeted approach that identifies gaps. And I think part of that because they're at a level of consensus that is one level up from the degree of prescription you would need to then use it.
I will say though that, if you look at high performing charter schools, they did not let that stop them, right? They said, okay, state test isn't perfect, but we know where we need to end up. And we're going to get formative exams that align to the state
Correct.
test that will give us that granularity, and we'll craft instruction, we'll hone instruction, we'll zero in on gaps. I mean,
Yeah,
it's possible.
that's right.
I think it's an incentive problem more than anything
I
else.
think that's right.
Ira, you had your hand up.
Yeah, I mean, not to, this is going to sound heretical, but I think it's worth at least considering the possibility that when these parents think their kids are doing okay now, like they might be right. Like they might have a better sense of their kids' abilities than Marty does, or like that Nate or does. And the parent may be comparing the kid not to the universe of third graders nationally now, or towards some common core idea of what a third grade kid should know, but to like what they were doing in third grade. And so like, I look at what my kids are doing in math or science, and I'm like, well, that's like, they're getting way more than I did when I was a kid. And then I look at the things that people are doing out in the world, and for a lot of what jobs that people have, like some of those skills are not required if they're not going to be college professors. Like if they're going to be, there's lots of jobs where the skill is selling more stuff, and a lot of the stuff that people are learning in school may not be so necessary to those things. Yeah. So the question of whether your kid is behind or not, or like how anxious to be about whether the decimals or fractions are learned in second or third grade, when your kid is like, doing stuff on a cell phone that didn't even exist 30 years ago, like it, and it's just like, I understand why, or the ACT test, like you're worried your kid's not going to get into college because they don't know the math. Well, half the colleges now don't even require the ACT tests. And the math, like the math that was on the SAT when I was a kid, like a lot of it now, like the kids, it's on the calculator, like, or you can bring the calculator into the test now in some cases, which you couldn't even afford the calculator when I was a kid. So, you know, I don't want to apologize for broken public schools, but I also don't want to like discount the parents early on in the pandemic had much more alarmed views of how their kids were doing. So maybe, at least on the Education Next survey, the more positive view is somehow anchored to reality. Anyway, I just think that that's worth considering, that alternative.
Right. I mean, I think it gets to the question of, you know, are we clear what kids need to know and be able to do by the time they graduate from high school? I don't think that, you know, well, Paul Hill told me something, he's a mentor, and said early on in the standards movement, there's a real big problem with standards. It's become a log rolling exercise, teachers sitting around and saying, I've got my area of expertise and that should be a standard, and I've got my area of expertise and that should be a standard. And the college is saying, you know, calculus is necessary for every graduate, and, you know, all the stuff thrown into a soup. And he said, you know, there's no empirical basis for this. We need to get to a space where we can say, actually, this really does matter for your kid being able to access the jobs of the future, or, you know, whatever, which, you know, are honestly pointing more toward creativity and collaboration skills and things than the early tests measured, and parents know that. But we gotta get there. And I think there's a foundation building around that. There are a lot of communities having conversations about a profile of a graduate. They're sitting down with local industry and talking about what do kids really need. I think that's a place for us to build from, and to level with parents, and maybe say at the high school level, not every kid has to, like, they're going to different pathways. They don't all have to graduate with all the same things. Maybe by 10th grade, this is the Swiss model, they have to have nailed some basic things that we can prove to you matter. And then from there, they build credentials and skills toward an academic path, or a different path that doesn't foreclose other options for them, but allows them to start saying, hey, this is where I'm headed and these are the skills that I want.
All right, further comments, questions? Yes.
I was just gonna comment, well, first I'll say, I definitely taught students whose parents were definitely of your mindset of they're seeing what the kids are doing and thinking, I don't use this in my life, so you're not going to need to, so it doesn't matter. But also I was gonna speak to the fact that I don't think all teachers, especially in like a traditional like A through F grade model, where you have that flexibility to kind of fudge grades and give them a little more if you want. I don't think they necessarily always have the tools to give that information that you said you would want as a parent of where these students' gaps are and where they're missing. And I hear what you're saying about kind of this like log rolling contest of standards, but I spent my first 2 years teaching at a traditional school, I through grading, and I oftentimes didn't know what to tell parents about what was like missing in their students. And then I moved to a school that was standards based, that used like 1 through 4. There was no flexibility in, like, you either did it or didn't. But I was able to tell parents, this is the thing that your kid can't do. This is the thing that we're working on together, and that you can help me work to fill those gaps. But I think that's not a skill that all teachers are taught or know.
Yes, that's a great point. And my son attends a Summit charter school. It's a California and Washington State network of charters, and it's along those lines. So he gets his grade based on mastering, going through and mastering, demonstrating that he has mastered skills, and it's all very clear. He's either done it or he hasn't. And he gets also graded on his effort, because that matters. You know, it matters how much he's putting in, and how hard he can work to overcome obstacles and things. And a set of other skills that Summit believes are essential to the future, his collaboration capacity and things like that. So it comes together, it's formulaic, and he knows what he needs to do. He can earn higher grades by just going back and doing tests again and again until he masters the material, which is like beautiful. Great. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, getting toward grading for mastery, grading for skills that matter is great. I think your point is really well taken. Teachers are not getting what they need to do any of these things. And that's where we're seeing districts. And we do not have the capacity to do staff development right now because we're besieged with all these other things.
All right, well, that's a sad note to end
Well,
on.
it's a
So
depressing talk
could you say-
altogether. I just can't stand myself. I hope it wasn't.
So we should say that, tell me about tutoring, just as a last thing, because I think having a tutor, you can learn so much on this one-to-one relationship. It is, if you were going to have just one recommendation for what we need to do with those students who today are lacking, they're not doing what is expected, wouldn't it be they need a tutor?
Yeah. Every researcher I know is like, tutoring works. It's just, you know, it's very expensive, and tutors it has to be done well. There's a lot of research now at Brown and other places about how you do that well. We should be doing all of those things. It's just a question of how. There are other things that matter too that can make a difference. Like, you know, in Oakland, California, this Oakland Reach group fought for evidence-based literacy curriculum. They weren't using curriculum that actually taught kids how to read, and that matters. So, you know, there are some things, more time on task. So, you know, if you need to improve your math skills, do more math. All those things should be coming into play in our schools, and we should not be doing, you know, remediation courses for kids where they get tracked into, you know, certain classes and never get back onto the fast tracks. That, like, it's not too complicated. It's just, for me, it's a question of how do we do it, and are we going to do it all within this box that we built? Or are we going to play with the edges of that box and see what's possible?
Well, we have been listening to Robin Lake, who is the director of the Center on Reinventing Public Education. And thank you very much, Robin, for sharing those insights with us this afternoon.
Oh, it was great fun. Thank you all for your great questions.